What do you need to start working with resin? Resin. Alright, I think that's pretty much it. See you guys in the next one. Bye! No, okay, really. This is gonna be the first video in a 3-part series talking about materials that you need to start making dice, or to start working with epoxy resin in general. This was originally gonna be one video, and then I started writing the script and it quickly turned into 3. So we're gonna break this up into 3 kind of different categories of materials and supplies. Kitty cat. Ah. This first video will go over some of the necessary equipment and supplies to get started, and more of the utility kind of items for dice making. Next video we'll get into different colorants, and the third video will be about inclusions and extra bits and bobs to put into your resin. So, basic supplies. Let's get started. Resin. I know I said it somewhat jokingly at the beginning, but really the most important thing you'll need is resin. There's a lot of options out there. Some of them are a thicker consistency, some of them are a thinner consistency. I use Art and Glow, which is kind of a honey texture. I like the thicker consistency. I think it makes it easier to do certain techniques like dirty pours, where you want the colors to stay more distinct from one another. But I also have a pressure pot, so I don't have to worry about bubbles getting trapped in my resin as much. If you don't have a pressure pot, or you are worried about bubbles getting trapped in there, it might be better to go with a thinner resin. It really comes down to personal preference. Molds, plus silicone and master dice. Depending on what you want to use your resin for, you may or may not need molds. You can also use resin to fill things like bezels, or you can set up forms for large pours if you want to make like a tabletop. For dice, you will need molds. There's nothing wrong with deciding to try out dice making by getting a set of cheap molds off of Amazon or something like that. Just keep in mind that you're not going to want to sell dice that you make with those molds. A lot of the designs are copied from other people, so there's legal reasons that you don't want to do that, and they're often harder to work with than some of the more professional quality molds. If you want to get a better quality mold, some people make and sell them. You might check on like Etsy, see if anyone's selling them there, or a lot of people will make their own. Best way to do that is either to get or make a set of masters, which is a set of 3D printed dice. I got mine through Revel Broker. I will link them in the description. You have to like join their Patreon and then you can access their shop. But they are very nice to work with and make excellent masters. And then you're going to want to get some silicone. I use Moldstar 15 Slow because I like the slower work time. I'm not going to go over the full mold making process here. The first video on my channel was about that. I will link to that. I wonder if I can do like an info card or something, like here. I'll put it in the description at any rate. Safety gear, gloves and a respirator. You're also going to need some safety equipment, namely a respirator rated for fumes and gloves. You don't want to be breathing in the resin fumes. You want to be protecting those lungs, protecting that skin. I've heard you can get a pretty nasty allergy to the stuff if you come into contact with it a lot, which does not sound fun, especially if you want to keep working with it. It's just better to be safe than sorry to keep your lungs and your skin safe. A good location. Alright, this is kind of an odd one because it's not really a supply or material, but it is something to keep in mind. You're gonna want to find a good location. You're gonna want a place that has good ventilation, and you don't want any pets or kids in that area. You don't expose them to fumes or have them running into things. I have a room in my basement that I use, but I know some folks use their garage or a shed out back. It's good to keep in mind when picking a spot that high humidity and low temperatures can keep your resin from curing though. You're also gonna want to expect wherever you're working to get messy. You're either going to want to pick a surface that you're okay with getting coated in resin, or you might look into getting a silicone mat or something else that you can put down on your workspace to keep it clean. Measuring/mixing cups and stir sticks. You're also going to want something to measure your resin in and a way to mix it up. A lot of resins will tell you a ratio by volume of A to B. Part A is usually the resin, part B is usually the hardener. Some resins are by weight, so you want to make sure you check that, because if it's by weight, you're going to need a scale as well to measure out your 2 parts. My resin is by volume, so I just measure directly into some silicone mixing cups, fill it up to 50 milliliters with one and then fill it up to 100 with the other. You can also use medicine cups. Those are nice. They have the little lines, but you could also just grab 2 cups. If it's a 1-to-1 ratio, you could literally just grab any 2 cups that are the same and fill them to the same level, and then pour those into a container together to mix. And then to mix them up, popsicle sticks, the little like coffee stir sticks, tongue depressors, or some of the bigger silicone stir sticks are great if you want to do a large amount of resin. It really depends on how much resin you're mixing up and the container that you're mixing it in. If you're mixing up a small amount, you'll probably want a smaller thing to mix up, and if you're mixing up a larger amount, you're probably going to need a bigger stir stick. That's really all you technically need to get started. There are a couple things though that I want to mention that I also find quite useful. A pressure pot and air compressor. A pressure pot is a pot that you put your resin in while it's curing to cure it under about 35 to 40 psi of pressure. The pressure squishes the bubbles down so small that you can't see them, they're invisible, and it makes your resin crystal clear. You can order a pressure pot specifically for resin, or you can get a paint pot from like Harbor Freight and modify it yourself. There's lots of videos on YouTube on how to do that. I have one of each at this point. The Harbor Freight one was less expensive, but it was more work in that I had to modify it myself, and also I spent a fair amount of time trying to figure out where it was leaking air, whereas the one that I have now that is built for resin I have found is much more reliable. It's really up to you which one you want to go with, weighing cost versus time and energy and reliability. You'll also need an air compressor. I'm actually going to put a link in the description to a different air compressor than the one I use. I've had multiple people tell me that it's super quiet and works well, whereas mine is loud as heck and doesn't always hold pressure the best. So I might switch to it at some point. Paper or shop towels and tweezers. I also find paper towels or shop rags to be useful. I actually use these, which are kind of in between a cloth and a fabric, because they're sturdy but also disposable and soft. They're very useful for cleaning up spills, wiping off tweezers, which going off of that, I also like having a pair of tweezers around. That's very useful for putting little things into molds or taking little things out of molds if there's like little chips of resin or cat fur in my case. UV resin and glue. A bottle of UV resin is helpful for affixing things or making support structures for things that I want to put into dice. I will also sometimes use just Elmer's glue to attach things together. Just make sure that that dries before you actually pour resin, and it's pretty clear. I use E6000 or Gorilla Glue to attach my resin pieces to other things like magnets. I will caution against using super glue. I've had some people say that it works fine for them, but in my experience, it turned my resin cloudy. Finishing supplies. Zona and or sandpapers, a mini pottery wheel, a tumbler, wood medium or ceramic medium, and plastic polish. Moving on to later in the process, you might want to finish up your dice or other resin pieces that you're pulling out of the molds. You might want something to sand off any rough edges, to do some polishing. So you probably want sandpaper or polishing papers. Some people can get a glass-like finish with just Zona polishing papers. I am not one of those people. I am not good at hand polishing, so what I have done is set up a wheel. A lot of people will use a mini pottery wheel. I have a lapidary wheel that I modified to work with the green Zona paper, and then I use 3 grits of 3M sandpaper, 1000 grit, 2000 grit, and 3000 grit before throwing my dice into a polishing tumbler with some hardwood medium and some plastic polish. Some people like the ceramic sphere polishing medium. I didn't like it as much. I felt like it didn't get my dice quite as shiny, but it is easier to clean, so there are some pros and cons there. It's really up to your personal preference. A sonic cleaner and or toothbrush. After polishing, whether you do it by hand or in the tumbler, you're gonna want a way to clean out the numbers. They get filled with resin dust and polish gunk. You can just do that with some warm soapy water and a toothbrush. So you might want to get some dish soap and a toothbrush. That's what I did for a long time. You can also get one of those little sonic cleaners. I have a little dinky one that I use. It works fine. I still sometimes take a toothbrush to things to get the last little bit out of there. I've heard from some other dice makers that have larger ones that the larger ones work even better. It's always useful to have a toothbrush on hand too, even if you have the sonic cleaner, just for doing a little bit of light cleaning on things here and there. Isopropyl alcohol. I use it all the time. I use it in a little spray bottle to pop bubbles on the surface of my resin. I use it for cleaning things. This stuff really comes in handy. Acrylic paint and a paintbrush. To fill in the numbers, I use acrylic paint, so you're probably gonna need paint and a paintbrush. You can try other things to fill in the numbers as well. I've seen people use paint pens or ink. You can just do some experimenting really, but acrylic paint is a pretty safe bet. Alright, quick recap. So, to go over everything I just mentioned in this video, to get started, you'll need some resin, molds or a plan for where you plan to pour your resin, gloves and a respirator, and a good location that has good ventilation and isn't likely to be disturbed by pets or kids or other people. Cups to measure your resin into and a way to mix it up. If you want to get a little bit more into resin making, I also find it useful to have a pressure pot, an air compressor, shop towels, tweezers, UV resin and various glues, namely Elmer's and either E6000 or Gorilla Glue, sandpaper and or polishing papers for getting rid of rough edges, as well as a tumbler with hardwood media, and plastic polish for that perfect shine. A sonic cleaner is useful for getting all the gunk out of the numbers, and a toothbrush, which is helpful even if you do have a sonic cleaner. Isopropyl alcohol. And then to finish things off, I use acrylic paint and a paintbrush for the numbers. I think that's pretty much it for this video. If you think of something else that I forgot to mention, make sure to leave your ideas in the comments. I will be going over some common colorants in the next video and some of the pros and cons of different kinds. And then the video after that, I'll be talking about inclusions and other things you can add to your resin for just a little bit of fun. Thank you, as always, to my wonderful patrons, who I will put on the screen here in my patron dance. And I think that's about it. So I'll catch you guys in the next one. Bye!